everyone, we are going to be doing a science lesson today. Hey everyone, in this video we are going to be talking about the scientific method. So for today's lesson you are going to need a pen or a pencil, your paper or your notebook, wherever you're taking your notes at, and you're also going to need your vocabulary tracker. That's the sheet where we have been writing down our vocabulary words at. So once you have those things, let's get started. So our lesson today has a lot of vocabulary words that we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to quickly go through each of those words, and when we get to them inside of their lesson part, I will give you a good definition for them. So our words are scientific method, variable, control group, control variables, experimental group, independent variable, dependent variable, qualitative data, and quantitative data. So we have 9 new words that we're going to be adding to our vocab list, and these are all specifically focused on the scientific method. So the first thing we're going to do is get a definition for what the scientific method is, and I've got 2 definitions here. The first one is our actual definition. So it reads that the scientific method is a method of experimentation that is used to explore observations and answer questions. So what does that really mean? Really what it means is that the scientific method is a series of steps that we follow as scientists to help us explain something we've noticed or to answer a question that we have. So if I'm going to pick one definition to write down, I think I would probably end up writing down the second definition here, and specifically the parts that I underlined. The scientific method is a series of steps that we use to explain something or to answer a question. So in short, it is sequence. And we know that sequence here is just all about order. It's putting things in order from first to last, showing sequence of steps or how I do something. So scientific method is a really great example of sequence that we use in science. And I think what you're going to notice is that as we go through our lesson, that we use the scientific method in a lot of things without even realizing that we're doing it. So the scientific method has 6 steps in it. Step number 1 is to have a purpose or make an observation. Step number 2 is to do research. Step number 3 is to make a hypothesis. Step number 4 is to perform an experiment. Step number 5 is to complete observation and analysis. And step number 6 is to draw a conclusion. So we're going to go through what each of these 6 steps are, how you do them, and what that would look like. So you're going to want to make sure that you have a blank sheet in your notebook or a blank sheet of paper, because we're going to use probably the entire page to take our notes here. So the way that we're going to talk about the scientific method is with something that we do quite often, baking and cooking. So I do a lot of baking at home because I really enjoy it, and I really like to eat sweets. So chocolate chip cookies are one of the things that I make a lot at home. So we're going to be using the method of making chocolate chip cookies to help us understand how the scientific method works. So we'll start with step number 1. Step number 1 is purpose and observation. We know that with purpose is the reason we do something. And then observation comes from that word observe, which means to look at or notice. So when we talk about noticing things, in terms of the scientific method, what do we do? In the scientific method, our goal is to determine the problem or question so that you know what you want to test. What this means is that having a purpose or observation is just explaining why I'm going to do the science experiment. We notice something, or we find a problem or question that we want to answer. So in my cookie experiment, what this means is that I have the following scenario. I have a recipe for chocolate chip cookies that calls for butter. I wonder what would work better in this recipe, butter or margarine. What I'm doing is I'm making an observation about my original recipe, that I use butter in that original recipe. And I'm noticing that other bakers use margarine. So my observation, which leads to my question, is I want to know which would be better. Do I want to use the butter in this cookie or do I want to use the margarine in this cookie? So that's step number one, finding the purpose or reason to do the experiment. Step number two is research. What we do when we research is we look up information. That's the whole goal of research. So after we create our question, we need to look up information about our topic to be able to perform our experiment. So our goal is to say, what have other people done? What questions have they answered? And what information do I need to know? So in terms of my cookie experiment, I want you to think about this for a minute before I answer the question. So what kinds of things would you need to research in order to be answering your question about butter versus margarine in a chocolate chip cookie? So what questions would you ask and where would you go to find that information? Now for me, I know that one of the places that I would go to start off with would be the internet, to kind of do some searches to see maybe what types of recipes I could use, what other people have used in butter versus margarine. I would ask someone who is a professional in their field. So I would ask a baker or a professional chef what they think so that I could get some information from someone who is a professional. And I probably would do some looking in some cookbooks too, things that specifically talk about the science behind why we do certain things when we bake. So I do want to remind you that this is not a step that is taken in your GED test, but it is a really important part of your scientific method. So you may not notice that research gets done when we talk about our GED questions, but research is still an important part for us. Okay, so our next step, step number 3, is to form a hypothesis. So our definition of a hypothesis that we want to add to our vocabulary tracker sheet is as follows. A hypothesis is an educated guess about the answer to your question. So we've seen this phrase before. An educated guess, we said that this is what we do when we infer. When we make inferences, we are making educated guesses. So in science, when you're using the scientific method, a hypothesis is an educated guess. So what that means is that based off of the research that we've done and the prior knowledge we have, we are going to make an educated guess about what we think will happen inside of the science experiment. And the whole part here is that it's an educated guess, right? So we know that we are not always going to get a correct answer, and that's okay. What's important is that your hypothesis must be testable. It has to be something that you can actually test, not just a statement. And generally, hypotheses are made when you use if-then statements. So that would be saying something like, if I have untied shoelaces, then I will fall. We're making that kind of connection between if-then statements. These are also relationships that we see with cause and effect. Cause is one thing that happens, and effect is the thing that happens as a result. So let's look at a couple of examples of hypothesis and hypotheses. So these examples of hypotheses come from sciencebuddies.org, which is a great place to go if you are just looking for some more information about the scientific method. So I found these directly on their website, and you can follow the link on this page to look at more information about hypotheses. So we've got 4 examples here, and I'm going to look at the second one on our chart here. So the question that this person asked was, does fertilizer help a plant grow bigger? So this is a question that I could use in my everyday life because I have a garden and I want to know whether or not I should be fertilizing my plants. So their hypothesis, their educated guess, is as follows. Plants need many types of nutrients to grow. Fertilizers add those nutrients to the soil, thus allowing plants to grow more. So their educated guess is that if I add fertilizer, then the plant is going to grow more. And that hypothesis leads them into their prediction statement. And the prediction statement is where we use if then. So they said, if I add fertilizer to the soil of some tomato seedlings, but not others, then the seedlings that got fertilizer will grow taller and have more leaves than the non-fertilized ones. So we're seeing that the if-then statement helps us with our prediction. So this is a way that we definitely want to look at for writing our own hypothesis. So far we've got 3 steps. Step number 1 was to have a purpose or make an observation. Step number 2 was to do research. And step number 3 was to make a hypothesis based off all of the research and prior knowledge that we've done. So in terms of our cookie experiment, the hypothesis that we could use, we really could have 2. It depends on if you think the butter is going to do better or the margarine. So if you think butter is going to make a better cookie, I could say something like, if I use butter in my chocolate chip cookie, then the cookie will be more tasty. If you think margarine is going to be better, then you might want to go for the second option. If I use margarine in my chocolate chip cookies, then the cookie will be more tasty. So we're using that if-then statement, but we're talking about our chocolate chip cookies. So let's move on to step number 4. Step number 4 is the experiment step. When we experiment, what we're doing is we are actively answering our question. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a list of the directions that someone should use to test your idea or test your hypothesis through a controlled investigation. That's an experiment. These should be detailed so that another person can follow your directions and perform the same experiment. It's really important that scientists are able to replicate each other's experiments because that's how we know that the results are true and not just a mistake that happened. So in our cookie experiment, if we're baking cookies, what should that experiment look like? Let's talk about some vocabulary, and then we'll walk through the structure of our science experiment. So we are going to be adding 3 vocabulary words to your vocabulary list. So we'll start with variable. A variable is part of the experiment that can change. We also know this is a math word, something that is a substitute for a number. So variable comes from the word vary, which just means to change. So the idea behind a variable is it's the part of experiments that are changing. So let's talk for a minute about our cookies. If I were to give you 1 cookie and say, okay, here is your 1 cookie, which cookie tasted better? Would you be able to answer my question? Probably not, because if I only give you 1 cookie, you can't compare it to another cookie. So we need to set up different groups of cookies to be able to compare with one another. So we actually have 2 groups that need to be set up. We have a control group that needs to be set up, and we have an experimental group that needs to be set up. Both of these groups are really important. So every science experiment should have 2 groups, the control group and the experimental. So we'll start with the control group. A control group is the group that contains the part of the experiment that is not being tested and is used for comparison only. So I like to remember that this is the original where no changes have been made. So I have to have the original because if I only make changes, I don't really know which change actually led to a result. So it's important that we change only one thing. So with control groups, we want to say that these are the original. And we also want to remember that you should have only 1 variable. So you are only testing 1 variable. So what I mean by this is that if we think about it, if you're making these chocolate chip cookies and I say, okay, well, in my first batch, I'm going to make my original cookie. I'm not going to change anything. But for the second batch of cookies, I'm going to change the white sugar to brown sugar. I'm going to change the regular flour to almond flour. And I'm going to bake them for 10 minutes more. Is it really the same cookie? No, because we've changed too many things. So I can't really evaluate them if they're not the same cookie. So we have to test only 1 variable at the time. And this leads us to our control variables. So control variables are factors that need to be controlled so that the results will clearly reflect the relationship of the independent and dependent variables. So these are all of the things that have to stay the same. So we would ask ourselves, what needs to stay the same? So in our cookies, all of the other ingredients are examples of control variables because they would need to stay the same in order to get a cookie comparison. So that's our control group. The second group we have to have is an experimental group. So this is the group that contains the variable being tested. This is where change happens, is inside of this experimental group. So in the experimental group, we have two types of variables. We have independent variables and we have dependent variables. So to kind of help us better understand these, I like to think about what those words mean on their own. If I'm independent, it means that I can do things on my own and I don't really rely on other things or other people. But if I'm dependent, I need other people or other things to help me do what I'm doing. So kids are a good example of someone that is dependent because they need adults in their lives. That idea of what you can and can't do relates to our scientific variables. An independent variable is part of the experiment that is changed by the scientist or the person performing the experiment. So what that means is that I am the one responsible for the change. So I make the change. So whenever I'm reading science experiments, I always put myself in the scientist's shoes and say that I am the one responsible for that change. Now, a dependent variable, on the other hand, is part of the experiment that is affected by the independent variable. I don't control this. So I don't actually make the changes with the dependent variables. The change in a dependent variable will only come if the independent variable makes it that way. So we want to think that independent variable is a cause and a dependent variable is an effect. I can't change what happens in the dependent variable if I don't change the independent variable first. So let's look at how all of these words work in our science experiment. So I've set up our experiment into two groups. We have our control group and we have our experimental group. So we said that the control group is the original with no changes made. My original cookie was the cookie baked with butter. So the butter cookie, is what I'm going to call it, is our control group because it's my original recipe. Some control variables, things that would need to stay the same between both groups, are things like oven temperature, the other ingredients, the size of the cookie that you put onto the pan, the cooking time, things like that. Now for the experimental group is where we make the change. So the change I'm making is substituting margarine in for butter. So that's why the cookies baked with margarine are in my experimental group. So in terms of our variables, we have independent and dependent. My independent variable is margarine because that is the thing that I change. I am the one responsible for changing the butter into margarine. Now we would want to say, okay, what changes as a result? Whatever changes because of the margarine, that's a dependent variable. So think about it this way. Once you put your cookies inside of the oven, you don't really have any impact on what happens to them in there. They could get crunchy, they could be soft, they could spread into one giant cookie, they could not move anywhere. So once they're in the oven, you don't really control them. They're going to change because of the ingredients that you use. So dependent variables for our cookies are things like the size of the cookie once it's baked, the texture of the cookie once it's baked, is it burned, does it taste good? All of these things are dependent on the margarine. That's why they're labeled as dependent variables. Okay, so we have gotten through the first 4 steps of the scientific method. So let's move on to our last 2. Step number 5 is observation. So we said earlier that observation is all about looking and seeing, right? It comes with the word observe. It's all about looking at something. So what do? It's our job that when we are performing our experiment, that we observe, measure, and record what's going on. We have to write down what we see. We have to write down measurements for things. What we write down is called data. So as you perform your experiment, you're collecting data. And there are two types of data. There is qualitative data and quantitative data. So qualitative data sounds a lot like this word, quality. So I know quality is all about how something is made or like its craftsmanship. So if I have a quality chair, that's a chair that's going to last me for a really long time. Qualitative data is information that you gather through observation using your 5 senses. So those are our senses of sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. So anything we can do using those 5 senses is qualitative data. The second type of data is quantitative data. And this word shares its root with quantity. And I know that quantity is just about numbers. So quantitative data is any information that you gain through counting something or measuring something. So let's think about it for our cookie experiment. What kinds of data would you collect in this experiment? What are some ways that you could observe and record data? Well, I know that since it's cookies, I'm probably going to be using my 5 senses more than anything else. So I'm probably going to use more qualitative data. I'm going to look for maybe something like the texture of the cookie, which I could get from feeling it, the smell of the cookie, and the taste of the cookie. Those are all qualitative. I might be able to measure the size of the cookie or count how many cookies that came out of the batch. That would be quantitative data. Now, once we are finished with our observation, we move on to our last step, analysis and conclusion. So when we have analysis, what we're doing is we're analyzing something. And the job that we do when we analyze is we look to explain information or reveal something, reveal information, once we examine other pieces. So what we do is that we look at the collected data and we organize it for ourselves. We use tables or graphs that can be used to show the data we collected. And we might use other types of graphic organizers or pictures. So these could be things like maybe I need a map, maybe I need a pictograph, maybe I need a circle chart, maybe I just need to show you a picture of what the cookies look like. What we're doing is we're showing the data, and our goal is to use the data to make a judgment about our hypothesis. And what this means, we're just asking the question, was your hypothesis correct or incorrect? And we know that it's okay to get a correct hypothesis or an incorrect hypothesis because a hypothesis is an educated guess. And we know that sometimes guesses can be incorrect. So after we have kind of looked at the data, it's our job to write up our information. We should write a conclusion that should tell the following things. Did your hypothesis hold? Was it the correct hypothesis to make? Did your results agree with your hypothesis or did they disagree? What happened during the experiment? What did you notice? What did the data tell you? And then you want to summarize what your investigation showed. And this helps us to lead to an active conclusion. So for our cookie experiment, what could we say is our conclusion? What types of information would we need to include? Well, depending on whether or not we said the butter or margarine would be better, we're going to get a different answer. So I'm going to say for right now that butter made the better cookie. Texturally, flavor, smell, all of those things put together in our data, butter just made the better cookie. So our conclusion would be that our hypothesis was correct if we chose option 1, that butter made the better cookie, or incorrect if we chose option 2, that margarine made the better cookie. And we would want to include things like how we made the cookies, the oven temperature, all of those things so that someone else could replicate our information. So now that we've gone through our 6 steps of the scientific method, we had purpose and observation, research, hypothesis, experiment, observation, and analysis and conclusion. Where else do you think we could use the scientific method in your daily life? So cooking and baking are great examples because we're always trying to perfect the things that we eat. Where else could we do these real life experiments? So I'm going to challenge you to think about where you have seen these experiments before or things that you do in your everyday life that help you to answer your questions. So once you have finished this video, make sure you head over to our Google Classroom and let me know you finished it. That way you can get credit for watching the lesson before you complete the assignment. Good luck, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.